welcome to Journeys and Journals. We're going to move from out east, west, today with the Pioneer family. And I think you'll recognize the name, no matter if you live in the north or the south. The family name is Applegate. River's named for it, towns are named for it, and I'd like you to meet Leta, who's an actual Applegate lady.
Hi.
Leta, what's it been like to carry that family name?
Well, it's certainly something that people ask questions about, and more since I've moved down here. When you live up north, it's not as much, but when you live in the Applegate Valley on the Applegate River, you certainly get asked lots of questions about the name. And lots of times people are kind of disappointed when they learn that the Applegate Trail did not go through the Applegate Valley.
Oh, we've got things to learn today. But let's start back with, when did they come to the United States? Can you follow this family tree back how far?
They first came to the colonies in 1624.
The colonies?
Which is pretty early on. And they tended to live on whatever the newest frontier was. That's tended to be where they were.
So they moved from where to where to where?
Without doing a little bit of looking, but they were in New York for a while, and then New Jersey. Just prior to the Revolutionary War, they were in the Albany area of
New York State.
New York State.
Oh, well, only there were no states. Were
there? They weren't yet, but they were in that area just prior to the Revolutionary War.
During the war, what did they do? Can you tell me?
At the start of the Revolutionary War, Daniel, which is Jesse's father, his father was in the war, was fighting in the Revolutionary War. He had fought in the war of the French and Indian War, a little ahead of that. And in the Revolutionary War, both Jesse's grandfather, Daniel's father, and his two brothers were fighting in the war. And Daniel's mother died when he was about 11 years old, and he was sent to live with his mother's brother, and they were Dutch. And evidently he was a very strict man, and Daniel didn't stay there very long. He ran off.
And just a young lad?
He was 11 at the time, and he went south about 80 miles cross country to Valley Forge, looking for his father and his brothers, because his father had fought with George Washington in the French and Indian War. So he kind of thought his father would be there, and he actually wasn't. When he got there, neither his father or brothers were there. The man who was in charge of the camp, a Colonel Shreve, kind of took pity on this boy and took him in and he became kind of like a camp mascot for a while. And then when he was 14, he actually enlisted and became the drummer for Washington.
The little drummer boy?
The drummer boy. And served from then, and he was actually discharged in 1783. The drum that he used during the wartime did come west when they came west. In 1843, I was on the raft that upended into the Columbia River. If you know much about the Applegate story, as they're coming on the Oregon Trail, they had to come down the Columbia River, the last portion of it, and the raft that some of the Applegates upended, and the drum went into the river along with both a son of Jesse and a son of Lindsay that were drowned. But the drum, another young man on the boat grabbed a hold of the drum and used it as a float device to get to safety. And it now hangs in the Charles Applegate house up at Yoncalla.
And I was just lucky enough to go to the Applegate reunion at the Charles Applegate house. And it's fantastic. Now that house has been there since when?
I believe that Charles built it in 1851 or 2. I'm not, but certainly in the 1850s.
Now there's another house you want to tell us about. Is that in the book?
Well, Jesse, when he came down Jesse, Charles, and Lindsay all migrated down to the Yoncalla.
So there's 3 boys.
That came west.
And 2 of them lost a son.
Son on the river. Both Jesse and Lindsay lost a son.
And so then they knew that was a really tough way to come west.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure.
And yet in 1843, the group that they came with, and that Jesse was a wagon master for part of it, that was really the first time that wagons had came west of Fort Hall. So they really didn't totally understand what they were getting into. I mean, there'd been a few missionaries came ahead of that, and even a small wagon train came in 1841, but they didn't bring wagons west of Fort Hall, which is Pocatello, Idaho today.
Now, when they came into Washington State, where did they meet the missionaries?
They certainly, Marcus Whitman traveled with the 1843 group. He had been back east to plead his case, because basically, as I understand it, and I don't know a great deal about his history, the missionary board that had sent him were kind of in the position of quit not supporting him anymore because he wasn't making converts. So he went back to plead his case and back east, and then but they didn't give him any resources to come back, and he manages to hook up with the wagon train that Jesse's a part of, west of St. Joe someplace, I'm not exactly sure where, and then he traveled with them from then on, and so they were with him, and they did go to Whitman's mission at Walla Walla.
So how do you know all this?
Well, a lot of that's in letters. Jesse, later in his life, was asked by Hubert Bancroft, who was kind of the historian of the time, to write about what went on during the Great Migration of 1843, as well as Oregon's history in general, because Jesse was a part of a lot of it. There had been, and to this day, actually, there are things out that indicate that Marcus Whitman kind of spearheaded that Great Migration of 1843, and Jesse kind of debunks that. He says, you know, he was with us, definitely, but as far as I know, no one who came on the 1843 train had any idea that he was even back east when we started. So there's no way that he actually spearheaded it. Now, and the fact that perhaps the letters that his wife wrote in particular did encourage people to come west.
Well, the thing that's so interesting or sad or disheartening is their story of Whitman Mission. It's a nightmare.
Well, again, a lot of that I think is a little bit misunderstood. Of course, the Whitmans came with the idea of converting the Indians to Christianity, and of course Whitman, he was also a doctor, and helped with the sicknesses and things. And then, of course, as with the coming of the West, the Indians didn't have any kind of immune system for smallpox, measles, all those things. They hadn't really been exposed to them. And with the coming of the white man, they did begin to be exposed to them. Now, again, that's a misconception about. A lot of people believe that the wagons brought smallpox to the Whitman Mission, and they, to a certain degree, may have. But the big exposure to the Whitmans, the Indians there, was in 1846. The Indians from that area often went south to Sutter's Fort to trade, and they had they would get slaves for the Indians down there. Yes, they had their own little slave trade. And they went down the year before, and one of the chiefs, and off the top of my head I can't think of his name, son was killed down there. So the next year, we're talking 46, possibly early 47, a group goes back to avenge that death and to also bring back some slaves. And in the process at Sutter's Fort, pick up smallpox, and I can't remember the number right off my head, but 50 of them die before they ever even get back to the mission. And so and then there was a young man there, a half-breed from back east, Joe Lewis was his name, and he begins to tell the Indians, Whitman's poisoning you.
Oh.
He's not helping you, because he was trying to treat them and help, and he's telling, no, he's poisoning you. So that's kind of where then the uprising came, and they did murder Whitman and his wife Narcissus, and again, I right off the top of my head don't remember the exact numbers that were killed that day, and then 54 women and children were taken hostage.
Well, now when you say slaves, that this slave trade, where did the slaves come from? I mean, did they steal people's children, or did they?
It was just among the other Indian tribes. If you were at war with an Indian tribe, that when you just, one of the things when you maybe captured or overran the tribe or whatever was you took women and children, or in particular, and
you called them, they were slaves, your slaves. Now, are these the people we're talking about?
They are.
Or we'll start with, this is the guy?
This is Jesse Applegate, of course, of Oregon Applegate fame. Earlier we were talking about Daniel, who's actually his father. So this is Jesse. There are no pictures that I'm aware of Daniel.
Well, it's a little tough in the 1800s, early 18 we're talking about.
Yeah. Well, of course, Jesse was born in 1811. July the 5th, 1811.
And where was Jesse born?
He was born in Kentucky. After the Revolutionary War, soldiers were often paid in land, and so you had to go to wherever the newest frontier was to claim that land. And at that time, it either meant you went out to the Ohio Territory or down into the Kentucky. And Daniel and his father both went to Kentucky. One of the older brothers, Benjamin, went out to Ohio. So Daniel, after he arrived down in Kentucky, fairly soon married Rachel Lindsay Dorsey. Rachel Dorsey Lindsay.
Okay.
And both of those are very prominent colonial families. The word was that that Daniel didn't have necessarily a big name or family heritage in the sense that they did, but that they favored him because he had fought in the war. They honored the fact that he'd been a soldier.
Oh my goodness, you may not have a silver spoon that you were born with, but you were a war veteran.
The fact that he had served in the war and had gone so young to do so, that impressed them. So they were okay with their daughter marrying him.
Oh my, sort of like, he has a good job, or he has a college degree, or he's
it was
in this area.
And the fact that he'd fought for the independence of our country impressed them.
Well, now the family was wealthy, you said.
Well, the Lindsays and Dorseys were, now not the Applegates.
And so they'd have china, and they'd have lovely things, and be used to lovely lace. And
yeah, that is true. I think they certainly were.
All the fineries of the culture of the East. But when they got to what was it like when they got to the frontier? You're talking about the Mississippi River?
Well, down in Kentucky, I think it was pretty primitive, truthfully. However, even at that, Daniel, Jesse's father, in 1820, he thought Kentucky was too crowded. So he moves his young family. Jesse was the youngest of 9 children. He moves them out to St. Louis, which is the newest frontier of the time.
Do you think he moved this way?
You know, I don't know for certain, because covered wagons are certainly more associated with the westward expansion, but you had to do something, so I'm sure they...
Right, no trains, no moving vans.
No, we're talking horses at least. I don't exactly know how they moved on out to St. Louis. Wasn't too long after they moved to St. Louis, and Jesse would have been about 9 when they moved, and his father dies when he's not quite 14.
Oh my, so he's lost... This is the second generation that's lost a parent at an early
age, correct. And after Jesse's father dies, his older brothers, Charles, Lindsay, and Lisbon, who was a brother that didn't come west, all think that Jesse is extremely bright and really hasn't had much opportunity at education. So they kind of pooled one of them was a rail splitter, and one of them was a blacksmith, and one of them was a kind of an upstart lawyer. And they kind of pooled their funds and sent Jesse off to a school up in Illinois.
Do you know if he'd had any preparation for, well, the equivalent of higher education, right?
No, I don't think he had it all.
Mother's knee, perhaps, or whatever Big Brother could. Memory work used to be so essential, and in the dark, you could always, one storyteller tell the kids, and they learned a lot. Those early days, they were dark, and you didn't have candles that could be burned or kerosene lamps every night, or the Abe Lincoln story, whether it's actually true or not, you know.
Well, I think it probably, to a degree, you speak of Abe Lincoln, the Applegates early on have a story about Abe Lincoln.
Please tell me.
After they moved out to the St. Louis area, it wasn't too long until Lindsay was one of Daniel's sisters, would have been Lindsay and Jesse's aunt, was living up in Illinois, and Lindsay goes up to visit with her. And he isn't there very long, and they called her Aunt Hattie. And she isn't there very long at all until one Sunday morning, a bunch of boys gather outside of Aunt Hattie's house, and they're going to go coon hunting. And a young man joins them that's kind of tall and skinny, and his first name's Abe, and he's got a real sense of humor. And anyway, they're kind of out there talking about their hunt and being real noisy, and Hattie comes out and says something to the effect that, "Boys, I don't like such levity on the Lord's sacred Sabbath day." And then they proceed to go on with their hunt, and after a while they do coon some raccoons, and then they end up putting smoke in the tree to make and the little raccoons poke their head out, and the boys think they all are so funny looking, and that at that point in time, Lincoln is supposedly have said something to the effect that boys, we hadn't ought to be having so much fun on. And anyway, that was the Applegates' first introduction to Lincoln, and their paths will cross 2 or 3 other times in the course of their story.
Oh, I can hardly wait. This is history. Hand me the book, please, because this is history. How? And you are the author, and how long did it take to write all these stories?
Well, the writing didn't take near as long as the research that went behind it. The research certainly, I don't know, 8, 10 years, but the actual writing probably took 2 years, and then the hard part, truthfully, is getting it published.
And it's brand new.
It's brand new.
And I was fortunate enough to be at the signing at one of the open houses at the Historic Society, and you do travel around and sign books.
Yes, last week I was just over at Butte Creek
Mills
signing books.
And now, folks, if you haven't been to Butte Creek Mills, let me invite you. If you want to see the way it was done, people would come with grain.
You still can.
You still can. Bring your own wheat.
And have it ground.
And the mill is run by water power.
Absolutely.
And you get to go down and watch and that's 100 and some years old. Been there since a long time ago.
Yeah.
They even had lockers there, which for those of us that are really old can remember, there'd be a place where they'd keep things frozen for you, particularly your vegetables and your meats. And you'd go to the locker and bring back a few packages of wrapped up food. Do you remember wrapping groceries in paper and tying them with string?
I don't ever personally remember doing that, but I certainly know my mother did, and I really do remember lockers. Anybody that lived in Oregon very long at all, you went hunting and you killed your deer or whatever and cut it up and took it to the locker.
I want to get on with this. You've only got me to halfway across the U.S. Of course, it wasn't the United States at the time, was it? Or was
no, actually, when they certainly came to St. Louis, Missouri was not, well, of course, it's United States by then for the eastern part. But
13 colonies.
But certainly Missouri in that time was still not part of the United States. It later does become when Jesse's still a young man and there. But after he went off to this school, he becomes, while he's there, they discover he's very, very bright. And an old gentleman who's evidently kind of almost a mathematical genius takes him under his wing and teaches him to be a surveyor, which he will use for the rest of his life to make a living, among many, many other things, but that's certainly his basic trade, is being a surveyor. When he leaves there, and he's only there a little over a year and a half, comes back to the St. Louis area. And I think that the greatest influences of his life happened during the next couple of years, because when he's in St. Louis, very quickly he's hired as a surveyor for the Surveyor General in St. Louis, surveying Missouri and a lot of that area. And one of his jobs is he goes to the post office every day to send out or to get land deeds and things that need to be recorded or need to be surveyed, etc. And while he's at the post, he meets Wilson Price Hunt, who is the postmaster. And Wilson Price Hunt had led the overland expedition for John Jacob Astor in 1811 when Astor was trying to set up a fur company, American Fur Company out here in the West. And so Wilson Price Hunt was one of the few people you could talk to who had truly been across the country.
And this young lad's eyes must have been...
And I think he was totally fascinated with talking to this man. And then through him, he meets, Wilson Price Hunt keeps, when the fur trappers come in for the winter, they store their furs in the basement of the post office. So through that, Jesse meets Jedediah Smith and all of the mountain men of the time. And so he begins to talk to them. He begins to work with them a little bit, helping them sell their furs and things, simply so he can hear the stories of the West.
Oh, and by this time he's still 20-something.
Yeah, he's about 19.
Oh, not even there. So he has this little bit of education. He has this little training. He has a little, and his eyes are open, and he says,
well, he's not quite ready to say go west, because that's not really what's being pushed yet. And then the other person of real influence while he's there in St. Louis is he meets Edward Bates, who is a young lawyer, actually came to Missouri at the urging of his brother, who was the territorial governor for Missouri at the time. People with money, people with influence, and Jesse becomes very well acquainted with him, spends a lot of time with him, and Edward Bates teaches him about law, has a huge library, and he allows Jesse to use it all. And of course, the real thing about Edward Bates is he later becomes Lincoln's Attorney General.
Crisscross, crisscross. These stories are fantastic, because are they all in the book?
Yeah, they're in one form or another.
So it's a history lesson here. We've got just a few minutes left. Why don't you tell me, I want him to meet this lady.
Oh.
How can he?
He meets Cynthia one day out on his surveying jaunts through southern Missouri. He goes to a log rolling bee at a Mrs. English's house, and there's this young girl there who is actually just working for Mrs. English, but Mrs. English has really taken to her because her mother has died, and she's kind of been farmed out by her father. Jesse sees her. I always have to laugh a little bit looking at this picture. His description of her, he noticed her capable hands and how tiny and delicate she was. And somehow looking at that picture, you don't quite get that feel. And says as he left there that her face and her name was so stuck in his mind that he determined he never wanted to be where she was not.
Oh!
So he goes back and asks her to marry him, and they are married within 3 months of meeting.
That's so romantic. Now, how old were they then?
She was not quite 20, and he was just a little over 20.
So that fits in perfectly with this first chapter of this family. The family, we'll just fill in, they were both without roots of parent.
She certainly was, and he to a lesser degree, but yes, with his father's death, that certainly the family kind of was disrupted, and her story, really, she certainly had very few family roots. So
then they're free to go.
Yeah, when the time does come to decide to go west, there were a lot of things that brought about that decision, but when it does come, Cynthia does bring a younger brother with her when they come, and of course Jesse brings 2 of his brothers in their families.
And that was when Jesse's how old?
He was 32 when they started west.
So there's been a while since
marriage
till now.
They marriage and they go down on the Osage River and establish a very productive farm and have a grist mill, and you kind of almost have to wonder why they decided to pack up and move.
Well, I look forward to the next installment on this. Of course, it's here in the book, Jesse Applegate, Dialogue with Destiny.
That when he gets ready to go west, he writes a letter to his brother Lisbon and says, we've decided to go west. I can't begin to explain why. The only explanation is it's my destiny.
Oh, perfect title. Thank you so much for being my guest. I'm Bernie Martin Beck, and if you'd like to know more about this, I'm sure this book is available in your library, your bookstore. Thanks for tuning in.